All right. Well, good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, or depending on where you are, it might be any time of day. We're going to go ahead and get started with our this episode of For Us, By Us, a web series sponsored by the Center for the Study of HBCUs at Virginia Union University. I'm Terrell Strayhorn, Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, also Director of the Center for the Study of HBCUs. Delighted to be joined by our Research Associate in the Center, Jordan Bonner. And we have a distinguished panel of guests who will be introduced in a moment. First, we just want to welcome you to the session, let you know we're live on Facebook. We are also streaming through the VUU Global platform. So welcome to everyone. It's not too late to send the link to someone and have them join us for this discussion. Please feel free to use the chat box to let us know who's in the virtual house, so to speak. You can also, apart from shout out, say welcome, share your thoughts, but we also have the Q&A panel activated for this session. And we invite you to share questions there. Both Jordan and myself will be monitoring the Q&A as we move through the session. This session is recorded. We are going live right now on Facebook, but it is a recorded session. That recording will be posted to the VUU TV channel on YouTube following this session. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to my co-host, Jordan Bonner, to introduce himself, and then I'll come back for some introductions of our panelists. Good morning, Jordan.
You keep saying morning, it's afternoon, Dr. Strayhorn here. But but yes, I'm Jordan Bonner, Research Associate at the Center for the Study of HBCUs. I'm delighted to be here with our three distinguished hosts and our guests. And yeah, let's get to it.
All right, great. Well, I'm stuck on Central Time. So in Central, it's morning. On the East Coast, it's afternoon. On the West Coast, it's really early. So I should stop saying that because you'll probably watch this recording at nighttime. So hello to everyone. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to let you know, we do have three of our panelists. We are all living in an uncertain time, struggling or living through a pandemic where our plans change without notice. And so one of our panelists, Dr. Janelle Williams, will not be able to join us today because her plans had to change the last minute. So we certainly send love and light out to her and the work that she's doing, and look forward to having her on a future episode of For Us, By Us. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists in alpha order. And that is starting with Jarrett L. Carter, Sr. He's the founding editor of HBCUdigest.com, an online daily news blog dedicated to coverage of historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. He's also the host of Digest After Dark on Sirius XM Radio, channel 142. Go check it out. Not right now. Stay with this program. Then afterwards, go check out Jarrett's Digest After Dark, channel 142 on Sirius XM Radio. It's a weekly program covering societal, cultural, and institutional issues at HBCUs. He's a native of Seat Pleasant, Maryland. He graduated from Morgan State University with a bachelor's degree in English with a journalism concentration. He lives in Baltimore with his wife, Dr. Lakita Carter, and their 4 children. Welcome, Jarrett Carter. Second, we have Miss Angela Hayes. Ms. Hayes is an accomplished public relations leader with extensive expertise in brand development, product lifecycle strategy, nonprofit fundraising, multicultural engagement, corporate social responsibility, and, as if that was not enough, cause marketing. She's a 27-year veteran of the communications industry, Senior Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Brodeur Partners. She provides strategic oversight to the organization's plans to ensure inclusivity and to reach diverse stakeholder groups. And in this role, she leads the accounts supporting various industries, healthcare, nonprofit. She's as a Forbes contributor and frequently sought after conference speaker. She's published content related to creating a more inclusive society. Welcome, Ms. Hayes. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Jamal Watson. who is journalist and communications professional whose focus has been on higher education now for more than 2 decades. A contributor to diverse issues in higher education, Watson has served the publication for many years as executive editor, senior staff writer, and most recently, editor at large. In addition to his consulting work and leadership in the field of higher education, Watson currently teaches communication studies at Trinity Washington University and has worked with a number of folks on this panel and likely in our audience for a number of years. Welcome, Dr. Watson. We welcome you all. We're excited for, really looking forward to a robust conversation. Jordan's going to kick us off, but again, to those of you in our listening audience and those in our live audience, please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A function to raise questions. Back in your hands, Jordan.
Okay, so first question. So my short time working at a HBCU, I can't begin to count how many times I've heard phrases like, we need to rewrite the narrative, tell our story, and sustain our power. What does it mean to tell our story, and who should we tell it to?
So I'll go first. One is, I don't know if we need to rewrite the narrative, because I think the narrative is already there, right? The narrative is a brilliant one that tells a story about how these institutions have been able to survive, and not only survive, but to thrive over these many years, and have produced geniuses like Langston Hughes and Thurgood Marshall and Toni Morrison and Kamala Harris. So I don't know if we need to rewrite it. When I think about your question, Jordan, I'm reminded of what Dr. Fred Bonner at Prairie View A&M University often says. And he says that it's important that we maintain dominion over our narrative, that we not outsource it to others, because when we do so, then I think people can add in all kinds of other things about what the value of HBCUs are in our society. I remember I was on a panel a couple of years ago with Dr. Walter Kimbrough at Dillard. And again, Dr. Kimbrough made a very important point, that the discussion that often takes place about the relevance of HBCUs is a silly question, and we should just dismiss it. Are HBCUs relevant? Of course they are. They always have been. But instead, I think what we need to do is begin to tell and help others understand the value of our institutions in the contemporary society we live in. And that's a challenge, right? Because many of our institutions are under-resourced. They don't necessarily have the PR apparatus to be able to do that, which is why telling the story should not be left up to just a PR professional. It really has to be all hands on deck, from the president on down to the students. And I think what Jared Carter has been able to do with his platform has been amazing, because he has introduced folks to the genius of HBCUs who otherwise did not know much about many of these storied institutions.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. I guess that leads nicely into the second question that I had, unless anybody else, do you have any comments, Ms. Hayes? Or
I do, and just to kind of piggyback on Mr. Watson's comments, I agree 100%. First of all, I would like to say, like to commend you and Dr. Strayhorn for your efforts to begin to put compelling content into the marketplace to tell Virginia Union's story in a different way. I think it's models like this that help create connectivity with communities that will keep the story alive and help to differentiate the unique value. And I think what Mr. Watson was speaking to, and from my experience, I have the good fortune to be embedded in Virginia Union as a communications director through a partnership with my PR firm, Broder Partners. And what I've experienced from having worked with Virginia Union for a while now is that, like many organizations, struggle to be able to articulate the unique value of the organization. Like Mr. Watson said, so many of our HBCUs have people in a communications or a marketing function who are like chief cook and bottle washer. They're doing all things for all people. But I've always said to my clients and constituents that every role is a public relations role. Everybody has a responsibility for knowing your story and being able to articulate your story in a way that uplifts the brand. So I think that, from a learning perspective, that's one opportunity that I see for the HBCU environment.
I would just say that the biggest part of telling our story is really sharing first and foremost with our own people how we do common things in an uncommon way. I think the trap that we fall into as a journalism culture, as a media consuming culture, is to assume that, oh, this isn't a big story, or this isn't a big gift, or this isn't a big lift for HBCUs, because that's not a big story or a big lift or a big gift for higher education at large. And I think that if you were to properly contextualize what money looks like in the HBCU community, what do earnings look like? What does achievement look like? What does infrastructure look like in the HBCU community? Then you start to build a narrative that really speaks to just how powerful these institutions are. When you're catering to a constituent base with such a broad gap in income and educational outcomes and achievement and health disparities and so many other things that Black folks have to just fight with just to have a chance every day. And then you see institutions that are accelerating our ability to fill in that gap. You get a sense of just how spectacular these schools are. And then I think that you know who we're telling it to, we got to tell it to ourselves first. I don't think we have a clue. Even HBCU graduates, even some faculty, even some presidents of what we're doing. And just how amazing that these institutions are. I just one quick example. For the life of me, the better part of the last several weeks is trying to, tell some of the young people on Twitter and Instagram who asked the question, why does Howard, Morehouse, and Spelman get all this money, from private philanthropy? And I say, well, Lemoyne Owen just got $40-some million the other day. And Fort Valley State just got $1 million gift the other day. You didn't hear about it because you don't care to look, you don't know to look, and nobody's telling it to you. And so what do we have to reverse engineer where a transformative gift at Lemoyne Owen means as much as a halfway transformative gift at Howard University? What does that say about the brand that we understand, even just within our own community, where we think and look for Howard, but we don't think and look for Lemoyne Owen, which is just as, and Brother Strayhorn can tell you this, just as important, just as powerful, and just as good as Howard at what it does for Memphis and what it does for those students as Howard does in Washington, D.C. And so that's the puzzle we got to put together. Not that, we've been made to believe, we've been led to believe, that certain institutions stand out, or certain things HBCUs do, certain things that these institutions do stand out, but that everything we do stands out and every institution matters.
I also wonder if I could just jump in here, how much of, again, the mainstream media, their nod to what is the best institutions or the institutions that should be recognized, how much of that contributes to the kind of publicity that is often generated around many of these institutions. Because as you pointed out, of course, there are many colleges and universities, HBCUs, that are doing fascinating work. But I also think part of this discussion has to focus on how do we train and how do we push mainstream publications to begin to diversify their staffs and to hire folk who come from the Lemoyne Owens and these other institutions as well, to bring a degree of cultural sensitivity to the newsroom so that we understand the importance and relevance of HBCUs and not just focus on one or two or three of those.
See, if I could, I'd push back on that. Because I don't think that it's enough to talk about newsroom diversity as much as it is to talk about media ownership diversity. It is one thing for us to say, okay, well, we want 10 HBCU graduates to work at the Washington Post. Mm-hmm. That means none of the editors necessarily have to be HBCU graduates, which means none of the content that has to be finally published or released has to be HBCU related content. That the newsroom diversity is part of the equation. The content is the main part of the equation. You could send a talented writer from a HBCU to go cover Georgetown University. Mm-hmm. The other part of it is how are our institutions teaching our young people, teaching our alumni about the symbiotic relationship between institution and media. Here's what's baffling. And most of y'all who have read me for a decade know I don't care about telling the truth. We need to do it. It is baffling to me that we have presidents and some folks on this call and some folks in our universe who would rather get 2 lines of a story in the Washington Post than a 20-minute interview with the HBCU Digest or Diverse Issues. Y'all are crazy, because it doesn't make sense that you would rather distill your story for a larger audience than broaden your story for a smaller one, the smaller one that's going to invest in you, the smaller one that's actually checking for you, the smaller one that's actually going to send their student to your institution. So maybe the panelists can help me understand, Brother Strayhorn, Mr. Bonner, maybe y'all can help me get it. Why y'all would rather have $5 to spend at Whole Foods than $100 at the Jamaican Food Mart. I pose that to y'all. As a question. That's what I need to figure out. And that's the thing we need. Once we have the answer, then we're on to something in terms of media and telling our story.
Mm.
So that's a good point. I mean, I wonder, so here's what I would say, and I'm probably maybe not the best person to be the spokesperson to this question, as a person who has great respect for HBCU Digest, Medium, Facebook, any way to get, I realize we're now living in a society, or I believe we're living in a time where people want content. I think, COVID and physical distancing and just being away from people makes people hungry for something to do, really, something interesting to do. So I've been really impressed with the participation rates in our VUU Global Initiative, our Distinguished Lecture Series, the For Us by Us sessions. And I think it's because people want to get their message out. And so Medium, Twitter, Facebook, all of those just become this large canvas where you can share information. But I do know that I came up in an academy as an assistant professor turned associate professor turned full professor, where the premium was placed on, one, academic writing in a very restricted set of journals or books published under a very, very small set or list of publishing houses and presses that mattered at the places where I was employed. And that's similar to lots of research universities across the across the country. And so the kind of writing that I also enjoy doing, which is taking research discoveries or scientific discoveries and getting it out to the public, right? Translating science to practice, which you often would do in a blog or through a journal, a magazine article, or some sort of practice piece, was not valued, wasn't encouraged. It was actually, intentionally discouraged. But I still engage in that kind of activity. And I think for folks who are out there, likely listening to this episode, a lot of them are responding to those pressures, where, you might get an op-ed in the New York Times to matter to your review committee or your department chair, and we don't have the same weight in the academy for writing in other places. So I think we do have to work on that. But that would be my contribution to it, is that I think a lot of people are trying to make tenure promotion. Those are the people who are really writing and leading in this space, and it's just not valued. But I also am a person who believes that you don't write only in the places that matter for tenure and promotion. You got to have a message and an audience, and you do what you need to do to get that message out. I'll stop there, but other people can react and respond.
To answer your question, Jared, I never shopped at Whole Foods. It's too expensive. So, but no, in all honesty, if I'm being just upfront, I think I was socialized from a young age, we talked about this already, but I was zoned to Jack Yates High School right down the street. And my mom didn't want me to go there. You know, the sports were good, but academically it wasn't going to challenge me. So, you know, I ended up going to boarding school in Delaware. And then from then, you know, PWIs for college and for graduate school. And so in my family, yeah, I mean, I'll just say my mom, yeah, I never considered HBCUs, and I had no one necessarily telling me the value of HBCU. I think it was diluted, and it's until now where I've started, you know, to learn. I mean, I had the knowledge, but I'm learning more, and I'm starting to see the value in it.
But I think I just want all the listeners, I know we got to go to the next question, we got to go to our agenda, but I just want all the listeners to consider that the same thing that we tell our students not to do. Don't go to a PWI and be socially ostracized. Don't go to a PWI and just be a number. Don't go to a PWI and not envelop yourself in self-love and cultural affirmation. Don't do that. Come to an HBCU. And then we go and jump in a predominantly white publication.
Right, and we not only jump in a predominantly white, we also advertise, right? We do advertising and spending our dollars also in those white spaces as well. When, again, minority-owned and Black-owned publications are struggling to stay afloat. So those are also issues. But again, to my earlier point, I'm not suggesting either or. I'm saying given that we have the Washington Post and the New York Times, we ought to find ways to also push them, not to be easy on them, but to push them to also say they have to diversify. If you think about the history of journalism in this country, newsrooms often got integrated after there were these massive riots that took place. So in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, it was for the first time that you had African Americans being hired in any great number at the New York Times and the Washington Post and other media outlets. I think what's very interesting is now, after all of these social protests that have been taking place, you have mainstream newspapers beginning and news outlets saying that we need to diversify, we need to hire. I think this is an opportunity. I'm not suggesting one or the other. I'm saying that we need to find a way to push both HBCUs to engage with certainly minority Black-owned publications, but at the same time, we also need to support the white-owned and keep our focus, Jared, as you said, on management and ownership as well. I think we can do all of that.
I agree with everything that this panel is saying, and I would just push it a step further. I think before we get there, that our first responsibility is really to learn to tell our story and to teach our children to tell our story. I will say, Jordan, my life experience has been very similar to yours, although I grew up very much understanding the value and the culture of HBCUs. I mean, multi-generational family legacy of HBCU at Kentucky State University, which is, you know, when it was, before it was a university, grandparents, all attend, brothers and sisters all attended there. However, when it came time for me to go to college, it wasn't an expectation that I go to a HBCU, even though it's very much been a part of our culture. It was an option for me. And I liken it very much to the journey of Black women and their hair, how during the 70s and 80s, you know, I probably got the kind of hair that never should have had a perm to begin with. But as a teenager, you know, we were putting perms in my hair. And then you get to the point where you learn the value in a different way. And I think that learning and teaching our children at a very early age the power and the story of the HBCU community provides a platform to cultivate this new era of HBCU power that is rooted in the story and that has the skill set to be able to develop the partnerships that lead to advertising, that lead to that are competitive with, other what might be perceived as more prestigious publications. But it also sets us up to own our own content. During the presidential lecture series, Roland Martin did a whole session around the history of Blacks in the media, and went through a whole series of just how it came to be culturally that we don't own much of our own media anymore. And I think there's a unique power within the HBCU community to reinvigorate that and set up media shops within the HBCUs to be able to tell our stories, to be able to teach students to be able to work the continuum of the pipeline for storytelling in a way that helps us own our own story.
So speaking of story, and to keep it going in that direction, I mean, we've talked about it. Platforms like HBCU Digest, Diverse Issues, HBCU Collective, the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, and so many more have been highlighting the story, the narrative of historically Black colleges and universities in this country for many, many years, for decades. So let's keep talking about one, where should we be putting the story? And for those who are listening in the audience or who will listen to the recording, we certainly encourage you to, check out HBCU Digest and Diverse Issues and other places. What are the other avenues or venues for sharing our story? And then two, I see it all the time now. We all do, right? We just had the most historic election probably in our lifetime where, well, no, second in our lifetime. We had the election of the first Black president with Barack Obama. Now we have the first woman vice president who's also Black and Indian woman vice president who's also an HBCU grad. And lots of people are picking that piece up, which is now starting to shape or craft that narrative. So the first is, what are the venues that we should be thinking about or building? And then secondly, what are the contours of that narrative, the story that we should be telling about the contemporary significance of HBCUs?
That's the key point, the contemporary vision of HBCUs, because we keep hearkening back to what we did 50, 60, 70 years ago, and graduates who were dynamic 50, 60, 70 years ago. And even Senator Harris, she came out in the 80s, the 90s? So now you're talking about 30 or 20 years ago. So we're getting there. We're moving from 60 years ago to 20. That's great. But what I would say is there are still a lot of brothers and sisters who are coming out of HBCUs today that are doing dynamic things. I graduated from Morgan. I've mentored brothers and sisters that have gone on to win Emmys in news productions. I've worked with young people that have gone on to do dynamic things in engineering and the natural sciences. And so I think that starts with the storytelling function of the institution. And I know that it's a challenge for institutions to say, we're going to invest in media relations and we're going to invest in, kind of writers and graphic designers. I would even venture to say at this point, it's not necessarily media relations that you need. It's more so the storytelling apparatus that you have in your school, because with social media, and every single one of our institutions has a following. Every single one of them has an audience that's pre-made, that's already dialed in and wants to hear from you. If you're able to chase down and get stories about your alumni, get stories about the corporations and the donors in your community who are supporting your institution, talk about some of the research, some of the outreach that your faculty members are doing, at some point, the outside media, to include Black media, is going to pick that up. Many of the best stories that I get outside of press releases are in annual reports. The best storytelling you'll find with HBCUs, you'll find it in annual report, because that's when they're talking about students who've come from, really difficult circumstances and have achieved at a high level academically. This is the part where you hear stories about donors who've been given, a brother who's been a teacher and has been given, $10,000, a year for the last 20 years on a teacher's salary. That's where you find those stories. So, it misses me when I say we're not telling our story. I think the larger question is, when you think about placement, is even when you do place it, who's listening? Who's listening? Because no matter where you go, whether it's the Digest or whether it's the New York Times, if you what is the objective here? Is the objective to get more recruitment? That's a different story that you tell. Is the story that you're telling to earn more donor support? That's a totally different story that you tell. Is it to earn more research funding? Is it to talk to legislators? We got to sit down and have a conversation about the kinds of stories you're telling, not just, let's throw some stories out there. You play stories, and my sister on the panel will tell you, you play stories for specific audiences to tell specific messages that resonate with people in such a way that you get a desired outcome. So that, the storytelling function has to change at Black colleges. Not that we're not telling it, but we got to be very clear and strategic about what story is going out to who and for what purpose.
And I think when we frame the whole idea of telling a story, we have to recognize, of course, that the stories are not monolithic, right? They're diverse across the HBCU spectrum. And that's sometimes that's a bit problematic, because we act like all institutions have the same narrative and the same story, and that's not necessarily true. The other thing is, we need to find a way, in my opinion, to integrate student journalism on our campuses, which is already there, as a mechanism and a driving force to help propel these students to higher heights to be able to tell that narrative. One of the things that's fascinating to me when I was editor at Diverse is how many students came to me and said, I graduated from an institution, but I don't really have any clips. They had very limited kind of clips and to share. And I think it's really important, if we're going to have schools of journalism or journalism programs at our institution, that we really, really train our students to be competitive and to prepare them for again, jobs post graduation.
And if I could just piggyback on it from the PR perspective, I think that's one area where there's huge opportunity for partnership between HBCUs and PR firms. I'll tell you, one thing that our firm did this year is we bringing on interns, and I had the opportunity to bring on an intern who is a writer for Delaware State's online newspaper. And, quite honestly, confession is good for so bad for the reputation. I don't know how many HBCUs actually still have either a print publication or an online publication, but I know that for me, in my role in leading diversity and inclusion for my company, it was very important for us to be able to collaborate with a HBCU for that purpose specifically, and very important to me personally to be able to create a pipeline with students who are writers from HBCUs to get them into the industry and connect them to how the process works from the inside, so that they can apply those skills and help build up not only where they are, but create a pathway for them when they're graduating.
I think so many of the comments that you're sharing already are helping us get to a point that Jordan and I really want to talk about, and that is, pushing, you're the thought leaders in this space, right? So pushing us to think in depth about this narrative, about the story, and that if we're not changing the story, which we can't, right? Because the historical narrative has already been written. What we have to do a better job, and we've been talking about, is telling the contemporary story, because HBCUs that I know, or HBCUs where I've worked, often talk about, as Jared mentioned, the graduates from 50, 60 years ago, and they're important. That is an important part of the history on which the present and future success stands. But we will likely have folks in the listening audience and viewing audience who aren't even 30 years old, and certainly don't know anything about 60, years ago. And I don't worry about that, because as I shared in a meeting yesterday with some of my own team, we right now, Virginia Union, as one of the HBCUs in the nation, we graduate leaders today. You know, we graduated in recent classes, students who have taken a voice and a stand in what's happening with Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement local in the city of Richmond. So how can we amplify their stories and tell their stories even more? You know, I appreciate, Jared, I think you were the first to introduce the sizable gift that LeMoyne-Owen College received. And I know that we have a prepared question about that. I'll never forget when I was vice president for academic and student affairs at LeMoyne. One day, talk about stories, right? So one day I went to work and was in the hallway as best I remember. If not, I'm gonna make it up now in the moment. Some of this is probably exactly what happened. And I just remember being in the hallway. I was meeting with the then president, and her assistant brought a gentleman into her office who, I got to tell you, if you looked at him, you would have thought, you know, who is this guy who sort of just fell out of bed and decided he'd come to campus that day? Older gentleman, this is true, denim overalls, and, you know, unassuming guy, came in, said he wanted to meet with the president. And so the assistant said the gentleman's name. The president and I walked out to meet him. And Jared, Jamal, and Angela, the guy, just fell into tears the moment he laid eyes on us and said, I'm a graduate of the institution. I have my own business. I'm a farmer. And I prayed to God that if he ever lets me get to the point where I can make a donation back to this institution, that I would not be who I am without. I would do it. He reaches into his bib overalls and pulls out a wrinkled up check for like $10,000 and handed it over. And I mean, you know, and someone just, we received it. And then I'm like, wait, we got to reenact this and like it was just one of those moments where, I mean, and for the HBCUs and our listening audience, we have these every week, every month, you know, and it's not always a person in bib overalls and it's not always $10,000, but there is a story. Now, I have that story. The former president has that story. Probably her assistant has that story, but you've never heard that story. So to me, this telling the story and getting that narrative out there, this is that story that I think we have to also tell better. Any reactions, thoughts to that piece?
Well, part of that is, the first part is that it takes a universe of willingness and media savvy to do it. That brother may have walked in there and the last thing he may have wanted to be is in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, right? He may have said, I want to support my school, but I don't want a bunch of cameras on me. I don't want to do anything. I just want to give money. And that is fine. That is honorable. But that's part of the storytelling culture that we have to build up within our students, right? We have to ingratiate within them. Not that you're not humble about what you do, but that you use your success as a catalyst for other success to be born, right? So, you know, the students, when they get mad about something, they get all on Twitter. They go crazy on social media to say something is not right. And a lot of institutions fight against that and say, you know, stop telling them to school. Why are you trying to make the school look bad? Never realizing that storytelling, that advocacy is love for the institution. Is love for the institution. Just like we get mad about democracy, we get mad about elections because we love this country. We want it to be better. Not I hate America, I want it to be better. And so the students don't hate their institution, they want it to be better. So when it's not good, or when they feel like there are lapses in what makes it good, they speak out about it, because nobody wants to leave the institution and say, I'm never looking back here. And we got too many graduates that do that because their successes haven't been promoted. We haven't taught them how to do it. We haven't lifted them up, and we just think it's just par for the course. HBCU's got to be a leader in Black communities for making the case for elevating our own successes. And we can't look at it like, oh, you got a job, you know, you work for you're a plant manager in the local plant. Well, that's a big deal. Because how do we underscore that? That's workforce development in action from our HBCU. Mm. And the sad part is, at schools all over the country, particularly at community colleges, they do that all the time. Such and such got a job. What does that story indicate? You come to this school, you'll get a job. That's a major recruitment piece. That's a major thing that you're going to tell, you know, a 17 or 18-year-old, you come here, You pay your money, you line up with us, you're gonna have a job when you get out of here. It's the same thing that we go through with faculty. At HBCUs, we don't have a lot of resources, for teaching assistants. We don't have a lot of sabbaticals that you can take. It's so much that gets in the way of our faculty being dynamic. If we told the story of how dynamic they are, even with all these challenges, that makes more faculty say, I'm going to be invested in working overtime. I'm going to mentor more students. I'm going to do more research. I'm going to write more papers, because the school is putting people out there that do it. So we have to operate with a currency for our community culture, right? We have to say, if you're doing something, it's going to pay off for you, meaning we're going to share it with everybody, and we're going to teach people how to share that. So, there's a lot of layers to it. How we redefine gifts. The digest, our style, or my style, is a large gift to me is 10,000 or more. You talk to most institutions, they would say it's $1 million or more. But when you're talking to Black folks that don't got $1 million to give, 10,000 is a lot of doggone money. So why don't we reshape the way we consider major gifts? Why don't we rethink the way that we think about giving? How many community service hours have you put in at this institution? How many people have you recruited to this institution? You may not have given $1, but could have given the institution $250,000 for the amount of babies that you enrolled in the school. But we don't track that. So we got to operate with different currency, information currency, with our constituents.
And we also I'm sorry, go ahead, Angela.
I was just going to say, just add into that, I think there are two things that we really have to take a look at. And one is ownership. And I think that was mentioned from the very beginning. Everybody in the HBC community is a storyteller. Everybody's got the responsibility to tell the story. And two, the strategy, I think it's to Dr. Carter's, Mr. Carter's point, the storytelling is not synonymous with media relations. That is one vehicle, one channel, but social media is a channel, community presentations, one-on-one conversations. We have to be able to develop a discipline around our message and a strategy around our story, so that whether we're talking one-on-one with a student or potential faculty or potential donor, we know what that compelling story is and can communicate it effectively to help bring about the goal of what we're trying to do for the institution. It doesn't always have to happen in the New York Times. It can happen one-on-one.
And it can happen in an environment and in a culture where it's produced. So again, 30 years ago, we did not have social media, to all of your point. I mean, what is amazing to me, I remember having a conversation about 5 years ago with a college president and asking why he was not on social media. And he said, I don't do all of that social media stuff. And again, that's a disconnect, right? Because again, in terms of this contemporary right now society, the reality is that many of his students, and of course, many of his alumni, recent graduates, are on social media. So again, there's missed opportunities to be able to engage with that constituents, because we're not necessarily encouraging more and more of these presidents and senior leadership to also kind of stretch beyond the traditional boundaries. Sending a press release now is just not enough. We don't even have fax machines anymore. And so we've got to be very creative in terms of reaching a diverse demographic.
But I think that we got to be careful about that. One of the things that we run HBCUs the way we run our Black churches, the way we run a lot of our organizations, very top down. And it is difficult for you to say, or for anybody to say, do social media because everybody's on social media. Who gonna tell William Harvey get on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram? Because the first response I can tell you he's gonna say is, get out of my office. You gonna tell?
Well, it doesn't have to be William Harvey, but maybe it could be somebody in his office.
But my point is, a lot of the times the narrative is all HBCU presidents ought to be on social media. Norman Francis, when he was there, is not going to be on social media. Harold Martin just got on social media, and he does it pretty well considering what he wants to do with it. He's not going to get on social media and say, what's up with Fried Chicken Wednesday? But he is going to say, that here are some things that A&T is doing. So he's an extension of the executive voice of the school. So that's a good way to do it. But I think we got to get out of this thing like do something because everybody's doing it. Do it because it fits the personality and the culture of your institution.
Well, and it
Right?
also drives the messaging that we've been talking about. Again, I'm not suggesting that people do it just for the sake of doing it, but if we're trying to think creatively and differently about how we communicate, we can't just do, to your point about history, we can't just do the same things we've always been doing. We've got to find ways, and maybe that's not social media exclusively, but I'm saying let's rethink and reimagine ways in which we can take ownership of that narrative and push it forward. That's all I'm saying.
I know Jordan has another question that's going to turn us in a totally different direction. So one little more piece out of this, it's so good, is, yesterday in our cabinet meeting, I led some of the leaders on our campus through a discussion that had to do around, ultimately was about this, the story of HBCUs. And the question that I asked them, which I'd love to hear your thoughts about as well, was we were talking about quality, right? Quality institutions, quality leaders. And the definition of the word quality has to do with, it's a standard of excellence that's judged in comparison to something else. So that this is, I know this is, I don't know if it is, but I hope this is a quality blazer because I've worn blazers that aren't this nice. And I'm judging it based on that comparison. But then the conversation also moved into this discussion around distinctive qualities, right? And the question that I asked was, what makes us distinctive? At the time I was talking about a single institution, but I want to broaden it. What's the distinctive qualities and natures of historically Black colleges? And I got to tell you, I think this is where, I know it's come up in the chat, people talking about about stories and what we need to do to tell our story. And I think what makes a story interesting to hear is when there's something unique about it, right? And there are about 100 historically Black colleges and universities in the country right now. And, sometimes people respond to that and say, well, we're, historically Black. Well, that won't make us distinctive because there are 99 others, at least, that are like that. Someone might say, well, we're small and intimate. Well, there are a lot of small, intimate, historically Black colleges. So this idea of learning what our story is, what's distinctive and unique about that story, and then how do we craft it and tell it through these vehicles and mechanisms you've been talking about?
I would lead it off, and this is a line I've been toying with for years. So I'm gonna give it to y'all because my brother is running this panel. The fate of HBCUs is controlled by two very distinct groups: young Black women and old white men. The majority of our students and white men who control funding. So if you think about, these are the two groups to which we have to answer to figure out whether we grow or whether we constrict. That's a tough road to walk, right? Young Black women and old white men. So what you have to singularly do when you think about distinction is meet or try to convince older white men that this is what we're capable of doing, and this is what we're good at now. And this is why we are deserving and have earned funding and have earned support from legislative coffers, from Federal Reserve, whatever it would be, from grants, from partnerships, from corporate donations. And at the same time, appeal to 17, 18, 19-year-old Black women who make up the large composite of our campus and say, come here, have fun, get a job, find yourself, and be you. Those are two dramatically different perspectives that we got to meet at the same damn time. And so I think that part of the dynamicism of HBCUs is, as things have changed very quickly, particularly over the last 30 years, where funding is getting cut, where enrollment is going down, where media proliferation is going up and the attitudes and the necessity of HBCUs, at least in the mind of the culture, is going down, because now we only got what, 1 out of every 10 Black students in the country is at an HBCU. So you got a lot of moving levers, and the way that you find your distinction is, what is the thing that we do academically, politically, socially that meets the mutual goals of those two groups? So for example, if you look at a school like A&T, for example, they've done a good job of saying, here's where we are for the research triangle, and here's where we are in terms of North Carolina meeting the objectives of students across the state. Their enrollment has gone up exponentially over the last 6 years, increases every year, largest 4-year institution that we have, HBCUs. And at the same time, they've not lost the cultural identity that makes Black students, i.e. Black women, say, I want to be there. So that's how, I think that's an example of how you do that. For example, and that's different from Virginia Union. Because if you looked at what students expect and what the community expects at Virginia Union, particularly as a private institution, so it ain't as many white men running the show there. There's some, but not as many. But the infrastructure around Union says this is a school that trains ministers, doctors, teachers, superintendents. That's what we expect you to do. But how do you meet that expectation with, here are the young people that say, you know what, I would like to go to Union. I want to go to school in Richmond. And that's a program I want to be in. And I want to have fun, and I want to go to good basketball games. How do you meet those two things? And so the challenge is finding executive leadership, is finding faculty, is finding staff that understand, here are the groups we got to cater to. Here's how we find common threads between them.
I was just thinking, when we talk about the different kinds of stories that would be appealing, I remember a couple of years ago, many years ago, when it was announced that Mark Lamont Hill, who is now at Temple University, was going to go to Morehouse College and to teach there. I remember Diverse Issues writing a story about that. And then I began to think about how many other African Americans who were at predominantly white institutions have decided to leave to go to historically Black colleges and universities. It's an interesting, right, trend story. And what I found was that there were a number for a variety of reasons. And that's a narrative in the story that often goes untold, right? The idea is that if you are at a PWI, you're just going to be there, and not the kind of recruiting mechanisms that were in place at some of these HBCUs to actually go after talent and to bring them to their campuses. And it was a very popular and successful story that we wrote, because I think people realized, again, that was an element that had not been told before. So that's an example, I think, of the kinds of stories that we can also think about.
Ms. Hayes, do you want to offer a comment or two here on these points before we switch gears?
No, we can switch gears.
Okay. All right. Jordan, you're up.
Yep. So being mindful of time, and we're getting a lot of great questions in the chat. So yeah, I'm going to transition there. One question that we received was, how do we use our media and public relations to help educate alumni to become engaged in endowment and strategy building for our institutions?
Yeah, that's critical, man. And again, I think that you know, the panelists, and I think that, you know, the doctor mentioned that, you know, we got to do something new, and that endowment issue is something we got to do new, because I think that we, for a long time, ran our messaging and ran our public-facing communications about HBCU support to really hammer home the point of we need to get these babies to and through school. So we've done the Lou Rawls Parade of Stars messaging for a long time. Get these, you know, get scholarships to students. Get scholarships to students. That's the primary source of revenue, and that is true. But what we didn't do was to nuance that with, these babies are not going to come to campus if these buildings are dilapidated. And we can't keep these faculty any longer if we don't give them raises, right? And we don't give them research stipends, right? And we can't afford tenure track promotion. So we didn't, and we can't support athletics being as strong as possible if we don't, build up our endowment so we can pay for stuff on the academic operation side, and then let athletics broaden its own operations and not take from the other pile. So we have to be more strategic about telling people where a dollar goes. It does good, but it's quickly running out of good for me to walk up to Virginia Union and say, I want this scholarship to go to 19-year-old Black men from Henrico County who maintain a 3.5 in English. That might be 2 people on campus every 5 years. That's such a narrow view of the support we need. And what happens if we start talking about what does endowment return look like? What can you do with those returns? How do you look at places that have done P3 partnerships for construction? How do we look at places that have done deals or dorm development deals where you don't have to pay as much money down, and the bond rating, you don't have to worry about bond applications and things like that. So there's a lot of things that our stakeholders have to get involved in terms of understanding money. But then again, it is difficult because money is emotional. What we give to is driven by our emotions. And so it's about stocks and bonds when you're trying to give me a check for something you love. And now you're saying, well, I came in here falling in love, and now you give me all these statistics. I don't want to hear that. So that has to start early. That has to start with the alumni engagement. That has to start with executive leadership, particularly from the board, going to different stakeholder groups and saying, this is what we need. You can make the choice to support that or not, but our future success is tied to your understanding of this future need.
I would just add to that not only is it emotional, it's also very much relational. And I just want to emphasize your point that you can't start having a conversation with alumni about giving once they graduate. That's a instilling the value around investment is just as important to the recruitment message. And getting buy-in from the very beginning, it's part of feeling a part. And those conversations can't start after someone has graduated from college. Those are conversations that have to start much earlier in the relationship life cycle of a student turned alumni.
And I think to Jared's earlier point, again, every gift matters, and every gift should be appreciated and applauded. And I think, again, we have to get beyond only recognizing high tier gifts. I think it's really important that we do the outreach after someone gives, even if it's $50, even if it's $25, that may be a lot for them. And I think it's important to acknowledge that gift and to highlight it and lift it up in whatever way possible.
Let me say one other quick thing. One thing that we do that is a little bit different from PWIs is that when alumni and students are dissatisfied with leadership at PWIs, they get closer. If they want the football coach to be fired, or they want the president to be fired, or somebody on campus to be fired, they come in there with a check and say, I got 50 G's on it, get rid of him. We'll buy him out. Like, y'all don't even have to worry about it. I got the money to get rid of him now. And that becomes a transactional method of support. I don't like the leadership. I will finance the change myself. We don't like the president say, I'm not coming back here till y'all get rid of him or her. So I think that if alumni understood their true power, and students understood their true power to say, we love you to death, we want this school to be successful, but we're going to be guided by a transaction-based relationship, meaning if you do right by us, we'll keep giving you money. If you do wrong by us, we're going to finance you getting out of here. But the common thread is the money going to keep coming. The money's going to come because we love you, or the money comes because we hate you and we're going to get rid of you. But the money shouldn't stop coming. And so that is where I think that when we have conversations about philanthropy and support and defining what HBCU giving looks like, is turning that dissatisfaction into a power source for institutional change that you can continue to get behind. But as long as alumni are complaining and aren't giving, they're gonna keep the president. They're gonna keep that board member. They're gonna keep that faculty member, because there's no incentive to change it.
I was also going to just add, and it was mentioned, the relationship with the board, and we've seen a number of stories over many years about, again, the conflict that sometimes takes place between the board and the president, where you have the board basically wanting to run the day-to-day operations of an institution, and often those stories then manifest their way to publications on the front pages, in media blogs. And so it's really important for us to understand, again, what is the function of a board, what is the function of a president, and how can these two entities, which have a really important role, work together, so that we try to avoid some of this kind of posturing where you have, again, the board wanting to take over control and the president becoming frustrated with the board. And that happens quite often, and probably more than most people will admit.
So any other closing thoughts from our panelists? We've heard a lot from you guys so far, but just any other kind of final remarks that you have? Ms. Hayes, you're on mute. Yep.
I just want to say, I know we've talked a lot today about things that we perceive as needing to be improved in the storytelling process with HBCUs, but I would just submit that there are a number of things that HBCUs do well. We are cultural influencers and innovators, and I believe there is significant differentiating value in the fact that the culture of the HBCU is transformative. We take in people as they are and turn those students, wherever you're coming from, into the next generation of Black professionals at a higher rate than anybody else. And so, as we're talking about the need to tell the story better, I just want to ground us in reminding ourselves that that's because we have a very powerful story to tell.
I would just add that I think it's important that individuals lean in on and lean into people who are actually in this space writing the story. So again, to Jared's earlier point, many of us are open to receiving pitches, to talking, to visiting your campuses, to writing about what's happening. You just got to call us. You just got to let us know. And I think that kind of outreach and communication is not always present. And so I would just encourage the listening audience, again, to reach out, to let us know what's happening. And I think many of us would be willing and eager to help tell that story.
I don't think that we have to be beholden to predominantly white or white-owned media anymore. I think with social media, with established networks, we can cultivate the ecosystem of the messaging that is all that we need for our students, our alumni, our stakeholders to be involved. Just in the way that institutions need students to help them stay open, we need those institutions to support Black media. I can tell you front and center, there are a few white-owned companies that find value in aligning their brands with Black-owned media, other than unless they're trying to sell a product to Black people. But that is to say that nobody's going to tell your story the way we can. Nobody cares about you more than we do. Nobody's going to give you more inches or more seconds to tell that story the way we will. Nobody's going to bail you out like we will. When there's crisis or when there's success on campus, nobody has the context like we do. None of them. So I really hope that we get to a place where it's I want to be in the largest newspaper in my area once a quarter, when I could be in Diverse or HBCU Game Day or HBCU Digest, or, you know, once a week. We really got to get out of that, because our students are doing that. That's why we, you know, we're 1 out of 10 students. And then we wonder why we're still running around saying we can't tell our story. Yes, we are. We're just not telling it in the way that the 21st century dictates that we should, for the way our constituents want to read it. So just a couple, 2 cents.
It's profound. And thank you, everybody, for sharing your comments and just insight throughout this conversation. Just want to tell you again how appreciative we are taking the time out of your schedule. And for our audience, thank you for tuning in. Before we go, just want to remind you to mark your calendars for December 9th, where we'll be continuing with another episode of For Us, By Us. And sponsored by the Center of the Study of HBCUs. So we thank you all again. So
thank you
Thank
so
you
much
for having us. It was great.
of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, attendees. Thank you for those in the audience. Thank you for all the chats. Again, this recording will be available on VUU TV on YouTube following this session. Lots of great comments. Thank you to all who supported. You know, until next time, just stay connected to us. You can connect with the center on all social media platforms at Center for, the number 4 HBCUs. That's also our email address, center, the number 4 HBCUs at vuu.edu. Stay safe, and until next time, this is For Us, By Us, signing out. Take care.